In my last little workshop video called The Easy Clock, I mentioned how I was going to try and make a clock that was cheap to build. So I'm going to call this video The Economical Clock. Pretty well all of my clocks that I've made in the last few years have been wall clocks. I have made mantel clocks in the past, and I think I'm going to try and make another little inexpensive mantel clock here. I drew a couple of different designs and I sort of came up with this one. This will give me a little clock about 10 inches wide, about 8 inches high, and about 4.5 inches deep. Now if you did happen to watch my little video about the Easy Clock, you'll remember at the end of it I had ordered 10 dials and 10 movements from Craft Time Clockery. Well, they've arrived, and I'm going to make 10 of these little economical clocks. Now each one of these little clocks is going to have 4 spindles, 2 on each end. Now I know that's going to be a lot more work, but it's also going to be a lot more fun. What takes the time is setting up to make the first clock, but to make an additional one, you just cut extra pieces. Hey, this all worked for Henry Ford. I think it'll work for me. Now speaking of pieces, we're going to buy the pieces from right here. And I've been buying my lumber here that is quality lumber like oak or mahogany or even aspen. I bought it from here. I don't buy a lot, but I've been dealing with them for over 25 years. And right here is where these 10 little clocks started their journey. I'm just checking here to make sure these boards are exactly what they're supposed to be. And they're 4.5 inches wide by 3/4 of an inch thick. That makes it a lot easier for me when I'm designing something. I can draw it exactly to full scale on the computer. You can't help but notice that some of these boards are dark and some of them are light. Well, that's okay as long as I keep track of the pieces while I'm cutting them and keep the light together and the dark together, and when I'm assembling make sure I do it right, and they'll look just fine. I had originally thought of buying really cheap lumber and then painting these clocks. But you know, for a very little bit more, I can get the real stuff. So this worked out to $2.18 a foot here. And that probably works out to well under $10 per clock. Probably under $7. I'll figure it out later. Now before I start cutting away on the real stuff, I'm going to make a template here using this cedar board. This is a 1x6 5-foot long cedar board, and if I remember right, it was $2.56 for the whole board. So I don't have a whole lot to lose here, except that it's not in very good shape. And it's not a full 3/4 of an inch thick either. It's just a little over 11/16 of an inch thick here. We'll see how much we lose by sanding it. As you can see, this board is fairly rough. It was okay when I was making those cedar birdhouses, but if I'm going to be making templates for a mantel clock, I may as well smooth it down a little bit here. Well, it's definitely not mahogany, but this still looks pretty nice. It's been through the sander now probably 6 times altogether, probably 3 on each side, and in order to get rid of all the bad spots, we lost almost 1/8 of an inch. Now the piece of scrap mahogany is a full 3/4 of an inch wide, the same as the boards that I have. But the piece of cedar, as you can see, is quite a bit thinner. Now this won't cause too much of a problem, other than the clock isn't going to look exactly the same as the mahogany clocks, but it will when it comes to turning the spindles. The template that I have on my lathe duplicator right now is set up for 3/4 of an inch, a full 3/4 of an inch. And if I try to turn down something that's narrower, it's not going to look right. It won't be the same. I have a piece of 2x6 cedar left over from a project that I did a few months ago. It's pretty noticeably cupped, but that won't matter because I'm going to be trimming it down into 3/4 inch pieces anyway. You know, there's one thing that I sure do like about cutting cedar, and that's the nice aroma that's in my shop after I'm through. And here we have 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch stock, and that'll work perfectly the way the lathe duplicator is set up. The edge of the cedar board was a little bit rough. After all, this was only supposed to be a fence board, and I'm trying to make a clock out of it. Sort of like trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So here I'm just running the edges through the jointer, make them nice and straight and square. As I mentioned before, the thickness of these cedar boards is quite a bit less than the mahogany, but that's okay. It's going to do just fine for a template or for a pattern. The length's the important part. Now I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse here. I went and I cut these boards for the template, and I haven't even checked the order from Craft Time yet. I better do that now. And the order was just as agreed upon. 10 dials, 10 movements, 10 pairs of hands, 10 sets of nuts and washers. And I'm always amused that I get the batteries for free. And, well, there was one mistake. They sent along one extra little nut for the hand shaft. Shh! Don't tell Craft Time. Those pieces of cedar that I had cut to 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch are being turned down now. I'm hoping that these little spindles are going to, sort of spruce up an otherwise rather plain clock. I started out with 80 grit sandpaper here and slowly worked my way up to 320 grit. I don't think there's any use going any finer than that. After all, this little cedar clock is just to see how it's going to look. Just sort of the pattern. Well, if nothing else, it'll be interesting. I want the dial board to be exactly the same size as the dial. You'll see why later in this video. Now these dials are exactly 8 inches square, not 6 inches square as I had originally planned. So these clocks are going to be just a little bit larger than what I've usually made. It's going to be kind of a nice change. Now these dials have a gold border all the way around the outside. This border is just a smidgen more than 3/16 of an inch wide. So I'm going to router out a slot all the way around where the dial board is going to go, and the slot will be just a little over 3/16 of an inch deep, and that means that the visible area of the dial will be about 7 5/8 by 7 5/8. So that means that the sides of the clock also have to be 7 5/8, or a smidgen less. Wonder how big a smidgen is. Okay, here's some more boring measurements for you. Remember those mahogany boards at the beginning of this video, and I measured them and they were 4.5 inches wide? Well, that means that I've got to cut these cedar boards to 4.5 inches, otherwise they're not going to match. They won't make a good pattern if they're not the same. Well, I think that pretty well wraps it up for the Economical Clock Part 1. But in the next video, I'm going to show you a picture of a mantel clock. In fact, I'm looking at it right now. And it's been in our family for over 100 years. And this clock that I'm making, well, it's about the same size. But it's not going to be the same at all, actually, now that I think about it. Anyway, you'll see it in the next video.